All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kaylee Stocksdill. For those of you that may not know me or are getting to know me, I am housed on the Health Science Center campus in Oklahoma City. I am the wellness specialist for LiveWell OU, and I work with Lindsay Mitchell, the other half of LiveWell OU. And today I'm going to talk about growing herbs and just kind of do a brief introduction, go over some culinary information, and some little tidbits of information and tips. So Lindsay kind of beat me to it, stole my thunder. This is one of my, it makes me laugh every time, or maybe I'm just that cheesy, but it says, I just want to let you know that if you ever need to have a plant killed, I'm the person to do that job. So some of us may feel like that. For me, this is what happens when I try to grow succulents. I cannot grow a succulent to save my life. And that's why I do gardening workshops on vegetables and herbs, not succulents. So if you feel that way, you are not alone. Some of us, there's things we can keep alive better. And it also depends on the climate and where we live as well as kind of the structure of our windows in our house if we're doing some indoor gardening. So I wanted to also share for those of us that may be overwaterers or underwaterers, maybe you're an over fertilizer person. So Planta is an app that can help you log, keep track, and even let you know what your plant needs specifically. There are many apps out there that do this. I just really like Planta. This is not paid or sponsored. It's just one I have played with. So I thought I would go ahead and share that, for those of that, maybe we have a green thumb or we're kind of in between and it's that watering ratio that gets to us. This app is really good. So some fundamentals of growing. Everything has fundamentals to grow and thrive. We have our fundamentals. Plants have their fundamentals as well. So in regards to growing herbs, they love sunshine. They need at least 6+ hours a day of direct sunlight. They also need well-drained soil. This includes indoor and outdoor gardens or spaces. Minimal fertilizer to none. Herbs are actually fairly sensitive to fertilizer, and I don't know if you've ever been that person that's like, just a little bit more plant food, it'll do it some good. Not with herbs. It can actually do less good and make them less potent, have less flavor and all that. So definitely less is more in the sense of herbs, and especially if you're doing it outdoors, you don't really necessarily need to add fertilizer to the herbs to make them thrive. Of course, this can depend on your soil that you already have. If you have clay, you most likely will need to adjust that soil to make it more nutrient dense and rich for vegetables and herbs in general. You also need plants or seeds. You can start with plants. Sometimes it's easier to just go ahead and start with that little bitty seedling, and then other times, if you're feeling like a real gardening entrepreneur, you can start with those seeds. There are containers that you can grow in. You can do it in your house in a little pot. There's also various systems that you can purchase and invest in to grow, as well as outdoors. You can just do it that way, outdoors in the soil, and let the sunshine come down. You can also grow them with vegetable plants or fruit plants. They do have complementary qualities for that. They can also enrich that soil and enhance the plant that it's next to, depending on it. And I have a chart that I'll kind of briefly mention, and I will send out in a follow-up email to you all that really goes in more depth and lists even more than what I kind of did a snapshot of. Lindsay, do we have any questions? I clicked my chat box.
Yeah, real quick. It was asked what type of soil is best to grow herbs in?
So herbs,
recommendation?
Yeah, if you're growing like indoors, I just use like the vegetable, like you go get the little bag of the vegetable soil. If I'm outside, I just add it. I don't necessarily use anything special. I compost where I live, and so I add the compost into my existing soil to enrich it. Does that help? And then yes, you can grow them indoors. I saw that as a question, and I thought I'd reference the Live Well OU packets right here on the right. You may have noticed yesterday if you picked them up that the parsley and thyme are mixed together. And when we ordered these, we thought they would be packaged together but separate. The seeds would be separated because parsley and thyme are two different types of herbs. One is an annual. Parsley, well, parsley is technically a biennial, but it is typically treated as an annual. And then thyme is a perennial, which means it comes back. However, you can plant them together. They won't be detrimental to one another necessarily. You can just slowly kind of weed them out and separate them as they grow. Guess I have to click. There we go. So growing herbs indoors. There are so many ways you can grow your herbs indoors. The way I am referencing is going to involve soil. That from my first slide is doing it kind of that way. But you can do hydroponics, aero gardens, grow lights. Grow lights are also a good way to enhance what you're growing indoors and give it that additional sunlight that it may not get if you have small windows or you don't have any windows necessarily on this south or west side. That gives it that good amount of sunshine throughout the day. So there's so many ways. There's not necessarily just one good way. Sometimes it's playing around what works for you. For example, aero gardens are, they can go on your counter. There's all kinds of styles. They're beautiful. Hydroponics is another fun way to do it. Uses water. So if you're interested, there's so many resources out there on different ways to do this. But growing herbs indoors, as I mentioned, they do still need that 6 hours of sunlight, whether it's indoors or outdoors. They need that sunshine to thrive, kind of like we actually need some sunshine, maybe not 6 straight hours, but we need that sunshine too. You also could need to make sure it's a south or west facing window. Typically you get the best light in those areas of the house. You can start from seeds, cuttings from the garden, or purchase a more mature plant. And sometimes purchasing from a more mature plant is an easier route to go because sometimes they are a little bit sensitive in that younger seedling stage. Perennials are more often started from cuttings and propagated because they don't necessarily always produce a seed. Not all perennials produce seeds, so they do rhizomes, they use the bulbs or the cuttings and propagate them. Now, the growing indoors does cause a slower growth unless you have like a grow light giving it that extra bit of love and attention there. But that does not mean you cannot get a good harvest. It's just you have to harvest at a slower rate. So this would be good for cooking on the spot. So getting that little bit amount of herbs that you need for that dish that night. So not necessarily snipping a third of the plant and then a few weeks, about a month later, you want to snip another third. You might not have as much plant to kind of snip and utilize. Again, I'm just stressing, make sure you're not over fertilizing. Herbs are kind of sensitive to that. You may have heard me mention annuals, perennials, and biennials. So I'm going to go into annuals. And I think it's important to kind of touch base on these two, especially if you're going into growing them and you plant a ton of dill, basil, cilantro, whatever it may be, and you have set it up in your garden space for kind of an aesthetic look, but also for a culinary purpose. And you expect it to come back that next year. They're not necessarily going to come back that next year. And so you might be a little disappointed to see like all your hard work does not come back. So they only live for a season or year. Their characteristics typically include they're a little bit more tender, thin, they have fragile leaves, and they can be heat sensitive. Some of them can be very heat sensitive, which sounds counterproductive to loving sunshine and light, but they can be heat sensitive. Parsley and cilantro can be the more heat sensitive versions of annual herbs. They do grow all year, as I mentioned. You just gotta kind of monitor them depending on where you put them. So if they're out in the middle and they're hot and they don't have any shade at all times of the day, they might not do as well in the hot months. So it doesn't mean they're not going to produce for you, but they might do a little bit less because they're hot and they're not able to grow as well. Some examples of annuals include basil, cilantro, fennel, and dill. Those are some really good staples that you can have in your house, especially for cooking. So perennials, those come back each spring. Those are my favorite. Those take less work every year. I don't have to keep replanting them. Still need some love. Anything with gardening needs a little bit of love, takes a little bit of care. But it's worth it. You get those fresh herbs, it smells good, and they can be pretty. Perennials really love the sun, and oftentimes perennials need less watering compared to an annual. Not all of them, each of them kind of have their own niche that they prefer, but it's pretty easy to adjust to that. Examples would include rosemary, thyme, sage, lavender, chives, and mint. With mint, I put a little note that it is invasive, which means if you plant mint, I'm a mint lover. I plant it and I let it go wherever it wants because I just love the smell of it. But mint will spread everywhere. It'll pop up little shoots of mint all over your garden. So make sure if you're not wanting that, that you plant it in a container. For example, you could do a container within the garden that goes in the ground. And it kind of contains it for you. So that way you're not having to go and rip up all these shoots all the time. If you're not wanting to do that much maintenance. Lindsay, do we have any questions?
Yeah, we had a had a quick one. I lost my rosemary to the freeze in it and have found it hard to find a good rosemary to replant. Any suggestions? Sounds like someone else lost their
Yes.
rosemary to the freeze.
Yes, I lost mine free. I did. I lost mine. I had a big, beautiful rosemary bush, and it unfortunately did not make it. And I waited for quite a while to see if any green would come, and I was kind of like scraping it to look and see if there was any green in the stems, and they just broke. So I typically get mine from like local garden vendors. I like to go to the Conscious Community Co-op. I don't know that they have rosemary right now. They're located in Edmond. But I've always found Atwood's and sometimes Tractor Supply will have them. I like the ones that they have. Unfortunately, mine started smaller and it'll thrive, but yeah, you can definitely just go to any like Lowe's, something like that. Lowe's might be easier to find for you. So the cultivar art, yes.
And then someone else asked, can I plant lavender in the same planter with the parsley thyme seed packet that they got from us?
So I'm not 100% positive on the parsley thyme. I do have what I call my cheat sheet that I refer to on some items because some herbs don't necessarily play nice with other plants. But for the most part, they do. I have lavender with my mint. I have lavender, mint, and thyme and rosemary together in my front flower bed, and I haven't seen any issues, and they were thriving together. So I'm not sure about parsley, but I would imagine it would most likely be okay. But I have a cheat sheet, and I'll kind of look that up and send it in a follow-up email as well. Mint is a perennial. So it is an annual, and it kind of likes a little bit more water. I mean, it is a perennial, and it likes a little bit more water, but it also thrives with having a little bit less. So it kind of just depends. Mine does really well in full sun and shade. I have it in multiple parts of my yard. So Kelly, that is actually one of my talking points is when you're growing herbs and you want to use them culinary purposes, there's a lot of precautions in general about using herbicides or for treating insects necessarily. And they caution against it just because, you know, you're going to consume those products. And I know there are some ones that are considered safe, but I don't have the list for that. I know the OSU Agricultural Extension Program does have a list, and they have a table of herbicides on some of their data sheets. And I am happy to pull that for you. I personally don't use any kind of pesticides or herbicides in my garden or my yard. I use my herbs to be my pesticide, essentially, if that makes sense. Yeah, so garlic, red pepper, and onion spray. Yes, you can use those, are some good deterrents. So coriander and cilantro. Coriander is the spice name version of cilantro. It can be most definitely confusing. So back to harvesting and preserving, kind of with that pesticide talk, just making sure you're conscious and you're reading your labels. If you are using a herbicide pesticide, I can't recommend any because that is out of my scope, as I'm cautious and don't use them. It's just my personal preference, but there are ton of resources that can guide you and assist you as well. And I will go into the herbs for insect repellent. Obviously, there's not going to be 100% guarantee, but it can help with repelling. Yes, that is correct, Lynn. So with perennials, they recommend harvesting about a third of it. That is because once it gets to the point of harvesting, so when they're little bitty and they're just starting out, you don't necessarily want to chop off a third of it and use that all up. You want to make sure it's big enough to kind of harvest and utilize. So about a third of a perennial can be harvested when you're ready to harvest it, depending on if you're harvesting it to, for example, use it for maybe you're cooking. You might want to, if you're using it for cooking for just that day, you'd obviously want to use a little less. But if you're doing it to preserve it and use it for seasoning food later, about a third is what they recommend. So that way the perennial can continue to grow and thrive. Annuals, they say, can be harvested at a little bit more, 50 to 75%, because they grow at a quicker rate typically. Unless they're being grown indoors, they tend to slow down. My rule of thumb is for all of my garden is don't harvest more than a third if I'm just doing a small batch. But if it's an annual and it's the end of the season, I'll typically harvest all of it, and because it's not going to go dormant and come back if it's an annual. So a method of preserving, there's multiple ways to do it. These are just two of the most common and the ones I have success with. You can dehydrate them. You can use your oven, and you want to do less than 180 degrees at a low heat, and then open oven, open door, because you don't want them to burn. You're not trying to burn them. You're just drying them out, getting them hot and drying. And so that can take anywhere from an hour to 4 hours. And that seems very tedious and time consuming, but those fresh herbs that are dried in your home are so delicious. And they haven't gone from multiple hands over a month or two time period to get to you into Walmart or a store. You can also hang them, which is where you get like a bundle of them. You tie some twine around it, and then you hang them upside down. You want to hang them somewhere where there won't be dust blowing in and out, because you don't want your herbs to get all dirty while they're drying and preserving. So you can prevent dust with a paper bag, and you can poke holes in it, use a hole punch if you would like, and then you put the stem at the top of the bag where you would close it with the twine, and then you would hang that, and that kind of prevents the dust from hitting it, the dirt from hitting it, but allows for that airflow so they're not molding. Fresh methods, this is what I call using fresh herbs. You can use a moist paper towel in a bag in the refrigerator, and this keeps them for about a week, sometimes depending on the herb, 2 weeks or so. But you want to make sure you clean them beforehand, just a light rinse, let them dry off, and then put them back in that bag in the refrigerator, and then they're good to go to use fresh. Snip, lightly wash and use. That's one of my favorite, is go in my garden, clean, just lightly rinse them. You don't want to scrub them all up necessarily, because then you can wash off some of those oils that really get the intense flavor in your food, and then use them in your meal. You can also cut the sprig or stem and place it in a jar of water. Some people put it in their window. I tend to put them in my refrigerator. I kind of go between my refrigerator and window and use them. I do see some questions. I have some of those answers in just a few minutes, I promise.
Yeah,
Pinching,
and just real quick, if sounds like some maybe didn't have a chance to grab the seed packets we handed out yesterday. So we do have some left. If you're interested, just shoot us an email at wellness@ou.edu or wellness@ouhsc.edu and let us know your campus mail address, and I can drop them in campus mail to deliver to you.
thank you. So pinching and hardening. So pinching is a great way to, it's easy for like basil and mint leaves. It's a great way, you know, basil and mint leaves, you can just pinch right off. You don't necessarily have to snip them unless you're really just wanting to get that whole stem and take all of it. With pinching, you locate a pair of new leaves on the main stem and several inches below the top of the plant and below a decent sized bundle of larger leaves, larger, more mature leaves, you would just pinch it off. And what that does is it encourages leaf growth, especially with, for example, basil. At the top of the basil plant, you can see, you will eventually see, maybe not right at first when it's growing, it looks like a fuzzy green caterpillar. And that is where the flowers are going to bloom. My finger is the caterpillar, so you just imagine. You'll pinch, if you are wanting an abundance of basil leaves, you would want to pinch off that budding flower before it blooms. And that tells the plant, oh, I need to stop blooming and grow more leaves instead. It shifts the focus where it will grow. So if you want an abundance of basil, for example, pinch that off and it will grow. It also, by pinching above, like where you see a bundle of leaves starting to grow right above some mature leaves, that's another way to get more stems growing. Hardening, if you are planting indoors, then transferring outdoors, make sure you're hardening your plants. It's good for transitioning them. My brain says out into the wild, but it's good for transitioning them and giving them a whoa, dipping their toe in the water. Because if you put little seedlings out that have only experienced 70-degree weather, controlled temperature climate, and you throw them outside into the Oklahoma weather, where sometimes at night it drops way down low, then the day it gets really hot, the transplanting probably won't go very well. So you can do this over a 7 day to 14 day time period, and you just gradually expose them. For example, on the first day, you might put them out for an hour in the sun, or maybe it's in the evening in some of the lower light where it's not as hot, and you do it in the shade. And then you work your way up to gradually putting them out into the sunshine for an hour, for a half day, or whatever that might look like, to help them kind of harden. So what hardening does is it literally hardens. For a tomato plant, the leaves will harden, which helps it retain water when you transplant it, and they're not so soft. It does not want to move for me. There we go. And this is an example of pinching. I just wanted to do a quick visual. That red line is right above those new baby leaves that she is going to pinch, he or she are pinching off of, and that will encourage more leaf growth. So I thought a visual might help with that. I'm a more visual learner. I'm like, well, what does that really look like? Had some questions about, I gotta move my bar, I can't see my page. Companion planting and pest repellent. There's not 100% guarantee that if you plant this pest won't come. However, a lot of farmers, gardeners, herbalists, they use these plants to help repel pests. And so this is from Cornell University. They have a really good PDF, and I only included one of the pages of it. I'll send this out via email. It's a really good guide that shows you, here's ant. You can use mint, tansy, or wormwood are good pest repellents. I can say that mint does help repel ants. I used to have them terrible in my front garden bed, and since I let my mint go wild, I haven't seen them yet in about 2 years. So that's a good example of some pest repellent. I will send this out along with the slides, so don't worry about having to copy it all down. It's a lot to write. So companion planting guide for other plants. This is also through Cornell University. They have such a good guide and some really good resources. And I continuously use them for reference, because I love gardening. I love planting vegetables. And so I highlighted some of the most common ones in the red boxes that you might see right here. And I highlighted dandelion because a lot of times we think, wow, this thing is a pest in my yard and it does not make my yard look beautiful. But dandelions do have a purpose. They can also be kind of a pest of a plant. They're, but they do have benefits. And I thought it was important to kind of show that fruit trees actually thrive better when there's dandelion plants all around. Mint is plants that can enhance as cabbage, peas, and tomatoes. Sage, cabbage, carrot, strawberry, tomato, marjoram. I plant basil with my tomato plants every year. So that's another one that I use that helps enhance it. And then if you're using this on top of pest control, it can be beneficial to your garden. It just does not want to switch over for me today. All right, so I know we're kind of coming up on that 30-minute mark. I'm going to dive into herbs and the culinary piece really quick. But pop into the chat box. What are some of the differences between herbs and spices? What do you think they are? No one? Yeah. Not a single soul? You all know. That's what it is. You all know.
Is that what you're asking for?
That's okay. So
she said
it can be tricky, and a lot of times people are like, well, I don't know how to use spices, and they're referring to herbs, and people are referring to herbs, but they're using spices. So I thought I'd go over really quick what the differences are. And these are this basic, easy to remember. So herbs are the leafy parts of the plant, and they may also include stems. Cilantro is a good example of using the stem and the leaf. If you use the stem with the leaf, for example, in your salsa or whatever you're topping with it, it usually enhances the flavor because that stem contains a lot of the flavor. More cook time. Herbs are more cook time sensitive, so fresh versus dried. If you use fresh, you want to add it towards the very end because they are very heat sensitive. And then dried, adding it at the end can be more beneficial to your flavoring because it's going to release all of those flavors and the goodness a lot faster than using a spice will necessarily. And you don't want it to dissipate in the heat because it can kind of change its makeup as well. Examples: rosemary, thyme, parsley, and oregano. Spices are like the seeds, nuts, root, and bark of the plant. Spices can retain flavor longer. If you buy whole, you can retain the flavor much longer than you would if you bought ground right off the bat. Buying ground isn't bad, that's not what I'm saying. But if you're really just wanting to have like a whole spice experience and really enhance your meal, buying whole and then grinding in smaller quantities so you're not using the same can for about a year. They recommend for herbs and spices that are dried to don't use them longer than a year because they start to really lose that flavor. They do have a longer withstand time for cooking, so you can add them in earlier at the very beginning compared to the dried. They might dissipate compared to the dried herbs. Examples of spices include ginger, cinnamon, star anise, and turmeric. If you haven't used turmeric, it's so good. Then I wanted to make sure, when you're cooking, you're using dried versus ground versus chopped fresh herbs can be very confusing. And the goal when using herbs is not to necessarily disguise what you're cooking. You don't want to take away from what you're cooking. You're wanting to enhance it. It's to complement it and bring out the flavor even more of that dish you're cooking. So don't think of it as I'm trying to cover up everything about it. Think of it as I'm trying to enhance it and make it even better. So a quarter teaspoon of powdered or ground herb is equal to 1 teaspoon of crumbled dry herb, which is equal to 1 tablespoon of chopped fresh herb. So it takes a little bit more of the fresh compared to a dried. Some ways to use herbs. We're wrapping up, I promise. Ways to use herbs. These are just a few ideas. Dry them, as I mentioned earlier. There's various methods you can do them. Freeze them. So what I mean by that is, like, you can use an ice cube tray. You could put them in a Ziploc bag. One of my favorite ways to freeze mint is to use a little ice cube tray, fill it with water, and put some fresh mint into it and freeze it, and use those ice cubes for my lemonade or my drinks during the summertime when I just need to cool off. It's kind of refreshing and invigorating, and it looks really fancy as well. If you have someone over, you can be like, I'm fancy. You can also blend them into homemade salad dressing, mix them into butter alternative. Now, this is not the wellness person saying go out and eat a tub of butter. This is just me referencing a way to freshen up your butter and use your herbs. Because I eat butter and I use herbs to kind of change it up depending on what I'm doing when I do utilize it. Create a marinade, bake. Spreading them on your meals is a good way to do it, especially if you're doing like a sheet pan of veggies or chicken, whatever that looks like for you. Make a pesto. Fresh herbs and pesto is delicious. If you have never tried it, I would encourage you to give it a go. Add them into your favorite dish. Whatever you're cooking, it's there to enhance it and not necessarily to take away. And then the next few slides, I'm not going to read everything on the slide because that would probably take just a little bit. But I wanted to go into kind of cooking with it. So for some of the most common ones, I chose 6 more common ones. Like oregano, I went through and did flavor, some cooking tips, as long as also with what it might pair with. So some things you could put it on and ways to use it. Because sometimes you're like, well, I don't know how to use this. It's been in my cabinet, but I don't know how to use it. So like thyme pairs with broth, soups, marinade, cherries, figs, grapes, things you may not have even thought to necessarily pair it with. Parsley, tarragon, dill. I personally love fresh dill. It's a great way to I like it in salads. It gives you the flavor profile if you're not sure what it tastes like. And then with mint, lamb, chocolate, pork. Everybody loves chocolate, or at least I do. I might just be everybody. Plums, apples, and pears. And I have some recipes that I'm sending via email as well that I will follow up with on utilizing some of those herbs in cooking, and some more resources that I want to make sure I give to you all. And if you have any questions after this, at any time, you're always welcome to email me directly at my email, kaylee-stogstill@ouhsc.edu, or you can email us at either wellness email, and Lindsay and myself will get it. I always welcome questions. You're welcome to email me. And that's about it on today's herb workshop. Do we have any? I see, can't get my chat box open again. Yes, fresh parsley. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, if you have questions pertaining to planting, growing things, and cooking and great dishes and stuff, you want to talk to Kaylee, I am not your person. If you want to talk about working out and stuff, then I can talk to you about them. So we complement each other.
We do. We do. Yes. So thank you all for joining us. Remember, this is recorded, so you can access it at any time. I will follow up with an email that contains the PDF version of the slides and all the other resources I was referencing and a little bit more for you. I appreciate you hanging out with me for a little bit, and I apologize for going just a hair over the time. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.